ID and public education. Should ID be taught in public schools? This is an interesting question. Before a good answer may be given, a more fundamental question must be asked. Namely, what is public education, or at least what ought it to be? The aim of public education, in my opinion, is the acquisition of truth by the students. It is also the students being taught the ability to think critically for oneself. What do they teach them in schools these days? However, secondary education and grammar school as well is based on the pragmatic considerations of John Dewey, but Deweyan educational philosophy is brain dead and in and of itself can only produce young, brain dead adults. Indeed, it has done just that. I do not say that you, if you are or have been a public school student, are stupid or brain dead. That is not what I mean at all. Please don't misunderstand me. And I myself am a public school graduate. Rather, what I am saying is that the philosophy itself has a tendency to dampen or annihilate rationality. If left unchecked by parents, wise public school teachers, or even the mental acuity within the students themselves, then upon graduation, the diploma recipient shall tend to be deficient with respect to solid knowledge and reasoning skills relative to students of previous generations and other cultures. These sorts of young women and young men are what C.S. Lewis called men without chests. A human without a human soul can scarcely be called human. But there is hope. It is never too late to turn one's education around. The reading of good books is one way to do this. At any rate, this series of videos is not about a proper philosophy of education, and you may indeed disagree with my philosophy, or at least what I've said about disagreeing with John Dewey's philosophy. But what this series of videos is about is whether, or at least this section of this series, what it's about is whether or not ID should be taught in the public schools. I'll try to focus back on that main theme now. So much for the rabbit trail soapbox on the reprehensible state of the schools. Alright, so should ID be taught in the public schools? Suffice it to say that in my estimation, the public school system as it is currently sucks. Though if it were more ideal, conflicting viewpoints should be addressed. In other words, neo-Darwinism and ID, conflicting viewpoints. When I think back to sophomore biology, I remember a very, very thick textbook. There was so much material to cover, it wasn't even funny. So I think it would be a mistake to mandate the use of Darwin's Black Box, for example, as the primary textbook for sophomore biology. I do not think there are many within the ID camp who have suggested that it should be. And this illustrates a very important point. That point is, I do not think that the teaching of ID in public schools is anywhere near as big a concern for ID proponents as ID critics seem to say that it is. When beginning a discussion of natural selection, I would think a biology teacher should be free to mention, in passing, that some people in science have their doubts about the efficacy of natural selection to the degree that neo-Darwinists invoke or have traditionally invoked it. The teacher might say something like, quote, "Everything in science is at least a little controversial to somebody else within science. We have good reason to suspect there is a lot of natural selection, and we'll look at why that is so shortly. However, some people think that certain systems were designed by some intelligence instead of being naturally selected for," end quote. And then the teacher can go on with the lesson. There was no sermon here, no altar call, no plea from Billy Graham, just a brief mention of the fact that there is an opposing viewpoint. Good education should include opposing viewpoints, in my opinion. This is not to say that ID be given equal time, only that teachers should not be forbidden from including mention of it if they so choose. They are not saying they accept it, only that it is one possible view. So far as I know, teachers are allowed to do just this already. The various trials you may have heard of are thus seen to be superfluous. The people involved may have wanted more than this, the mandating of equal time, for example, for ID, but at least this much, a brief mention in passing, is already allowed under, freedom of speech. And as I said before, there is so much material to cover, there just isn't enough time for equal time. Whatever is the main paradigm, I suppose, should get most all of the time. And that paradigm currently is Neo-Darwinism, whether we like it or not. The student is not forbidden from looking into ID on his or her own outside of class, though. The teacher may even wish to suggest Darwin's black box as optional outside reading. But regardless of what is allowed already, the trials are a bit foolish depending on how you look at them. A court of law is incapable of making science by fiat. They really don't have the power to rule that ID is not science any more than they have the power to rule that Neo-Darwinism is. Constructing a science or a meta-science is beyond their ken. Of course, they can rule that it's science or not for purposes of the law. What the law will consider to be science or not. But that's not what I'm talking about here. I'm talking about actual science. They can't just say, well, this is science and that makes it so. So teachers are, I believe, allowed to include ID in their discussion and even should do so, whether they agree with ID or not. Natural science is supposed to be comfortable with dealing with alternative hypotheses. To ignore everyone who disagrees with you would give high schoolers a lopsided and inaccurate view of science. How much time is spent on ID, though, is up to the discretion of the teacher, but the majority of the time, it seems to me, should probably be focused on Neo-Darwinism. Moreover, ID should not be mandated to be taught, on my view, but the option should be there if the teacher wants to do that. Conclusion of this series. The main purpose of this series was not to defend ID. That's not what I was doing in this series, primarily. Rather, the primary focus was to clarify exactly what ID is and is not saying. There is a lot of misinformation out there regarding ID, and hopefully this series clears up any confusion on the issue. Once you know what ID is claiming, you can evaluate it for yourself to decide if you are going to personally accept it. So there you have my thoughts on the message of ID, though whether or not it is true, that is up to you to decide. Thank you. Shalom. Merry Christmas.